here's a question for you. Can God take something as horrible as tragedy and turn it into a story of hope? Well, in today's Bible story, we see God do just that as we continue our series through the book of Ruth. Welcome back to Bible Stories Explained. We're diving deep into God's Word together, helping you walk away with a richer understanding of God and His incredible ways. In the last video, we saw how Naomi and her daughters-in-law arrived back in Bethlehem. In the previous chapter, we learned about how Naomi's family was struck by famine and tragedy, which brought them down to Moab. There, Naomi lost her husband Elimelech, and then tragically, both of her sons, leaving her to care for her two daughters-in-law. Naomi urged both of the women to return to their people, but Ruth, one of the daughters-in-law, chose to stay with Naomi, famously saying, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, left, but Ruth stayed with Naomi all the way back to Bethlehem. As the story opens, we learn that they had arrived right smack in the middle of the barley harvest, and Naomi, being poor and needing food, told Ruth to go out to the fields to glean grain behind the harvesters. Gleaning was actually a law that God gave, which allowed the poor to gather leftover grain after the harvest. It was an effort to make sure that those who couldn't afford food during times of plenty would still have food. And right as Ruth sets off to the fields, guess who owns a field right next to Bethlehem? That's right, Boaz, one of Naomi's relatives from the family line of Elimelech. And it just so happens that Ruth, the outsider looking for food, finds herself gleaning in his field. Now, Boaz is described as a wealthy, kind, and godly man, and he notices Ruth, and he notices how hard she's working. So he asks his workers to intentionally leave extra grain for her to gather, and when she's done, he invites her over to share a meal with him and his workers. Now, over the course of the evening, Boaz discovers that she is Naomi's daughter-in-law, and he learns that she is not a random Moabite woman who just happened to show up in his field. No, God orchestrated all of this. Everything lined up perfectly for these two unlikely characters to meet in Boaz's field. And though there are some cultural norms that Ruth must follow, as a Moabite, a foreigner, and a poor widow, Naomi remembers that Boaz is a close relative of Elimelech, her late husband, and she realizes that Boaz could act as a kinsman-redeemer. You see, in ancient Israel there was a unique law where if a family member died without a male heir, a close relative could come and purchase the dead person's property back for them and marry the dead person's widow so that the family line would continue. In essence, the kinsman-redeemer was a rescuer who paid the price to redeem someone in need, and Naomi recognized that Boaz, being a close relative, could use his status as a kinsman-redeemer to save her family's name. So Naomi tells Ruth, "My daughter, you should go to the threshing floor and wait near the pile of grain. The man whose name you take as Redeemer, wait until he has finished his work and then uncover your feet and legs and go down to the ground. Then lie down and he will not fail to redeem you." So Ruth waits on the threshing floor all night, and she lies down by Boaz. And when Boaz wakes up, he is deeply moved by Ruth's humility and faith. But he says he doesn't have the right to redeem Ruth yet, because there is a closer relative of Elimelech who has the first right to redeem her. Boaz says he'll meet this other man at the town gate the next day, and if the man refuses to become the kinsman-redeemer, then Boaz will happily step in and take his place. Now, when the next day comes around, Boaz meets the other relative at the town gate, and he tells the man what he plans to do, asking if he'll take the job of redeeming Ruth, but the man refuses. He tells Boaz to go ahead and marry Ruth, since he himself is getting married and could not take on the responsibility. So Boaz is overjoyed. He gives the man some silver and gold as payment, and he immediately goes to tell Ruth that she is redeemed. And in the final chapter of the book of Ruth, Boaz and Ruth get married, and God gives them a son, whom they name Obed. And you know who Obed grows up to be. You guessed it, the grandfather of King David, and eventually part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. Okay, let's talk explanation. What does this story mean? First, we see God's providence in the ordinary. When things were looking bleakest for Naomi and Ruth, Naomi decides to move her family to Moab, hoping for better days, though it's not explicitly stated that God led them there. Everything that happens after they arrived in Moab points to divine orchestration. When Ruth decides to go gleaning in Boaz's field, we might think that she just randomly picked his field out of all of the fields in Bethlehem. But again, God was at work guiding her steps, lining everything up, so that she would end up in Boaz's field. Second, we see the faithfulness and kindness of Ruth. Ruth's story isn't filled with grand moments. Instead, it's filled with the small things. She's a faithful daughter-in-law who clings to Naomi in her despair. She's a humble woman, willing to glean in the fields, and she trusts God to provide for her. But God uses these small steps of obedience to accomplish His massive purposes. And in doing so, He shows us that He can take the seemingly most ordinary parts of our lives and use them for His extraordinary purposes. Third, we see the role of the kinsman-redeemer. We mentioned earlier how the role of the kinsman-redeemer was to buy back land and to marry the widow so that the family line would continue. But this points us directly to Jesus Christ, our ultimate Redeemer. Just as Ruth needed a kinsman-redeemer, we need Jesus. We were stuck in the slavery of sin and death, and Jesus paid the ultimate price to redeem us. So just like Boaz stepped in to rescue Ruth, Jesus stepped in to rescue us, and He did it willingly. Finally, we see God turning bitterness into blessing. In the Hebrew language, Ruth means bitterness, and Naomi, when she first arrives back in Bethlehem, she says to call her Mara, which also means bitter, because she feels like her life is bitter and full of pain. But in the very last verse of the book, we read, "And Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became a nurse to him. Then the two women went on and shared the food and the blessing, and they said, 'Give us thanks to the Lord, for He has given our offspring a redeemer.'" Naomi is bitter no more, because God turned her bitterness into blessing. Okay, let's talk life application. First, when life feels empty. If you're going through a season of life where you feel empty, abandoned, bitter, or hopeless, know that God is often working behind the scenes to weave redemption out of your pain. Don't lose heart. Second, faithfulness in the small things. Ruth didn't seek greatness. She was simply faithful in the small things, loyal to Naomi, humble in gleaning. But God used her small steps of obedience for a massive purpose. And third, Christ, our Redeemer. Ultimately, the story of Ruth is about God's redeeming love for the world. Just as Ruth needed a kinsman-redeemer, we need Jesus. Okay, that's a lot. Let's recap real quick. In today's video, we walked through the incredible love story of Ruth and Boaz. We learned how God used tragedy to bring Naomi and Ruth together, and how He used them to further His purposes in bringing King David into the world. We talked about how God's providence works in the ordinary, and we saw how God used a Moabite woman who was an outsider to become part of God's covenant people because of her faith. And we learned that Jesus is our ultimate kinsman-redeemer, who came to pay the price to redeem us from sin and death. Hey, if this video blessed you, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss an upload. And hey, we'd love to hear from you. What part of today's message stood out to you the most? And what do you think God might be saying to you through this story? Leave your thoughts down in the comments below. I'm the host. I want to thank everyone who makes these videos possible, and I'll see you next time on Bible Stories Explained.